that decisions about the future of children and the well-being of children should be based on the best interests of those children.
Tonight, the Government of Canada vows to bring control over child welfare back into the hands of First Nation, Inuit and Metis.
But today what we heard was that there's Indigenous legislation, and that's going to be interesting.
And First Nations child and family advocate gives us her take in today's child welfare announcement. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. The federal government has announced that along with First Nations, Métis and Inuit leaders, they are moving ahead on a new way to deal with the child welfare crisis. They're hopeful the system that takes Indigenous kids away from their families will soon come to an end. Here's Annette Francis with that story.
The Minister of Indigenous Services, Jane Philpott, got right to the heart of the issue of today's announcement.
Every day in this country, on our watch, someone walks into a home or perhaps a hospital room where a First Nations or Inuit or Métis mother has given birth, and that baby, toddler or child is taken away from their family.
As a result of these practices, thousands of First Nations, Métis and Inuit children are placed in the foster care system. It's a system that places many of these kids in greater risk of incarceration, addictions, human trafficking and homicide. Philpott says that's why a new co-developed piece of legislation with Indigenous leaders will be introduced in early 2019.
The legislation that we are co-developing is going to do two things on the basis of what we heard over and over again all across this country. People asked for two things. They asked that it would lay down a set of principles. Principles based on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Principles based on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. That decisions about the future of children and the well-being of children should be based on the best interests of those children, should be based on the rights of those children and their families.
National Chief Perry Bellegarde of the Assembly of First Nations says it's a turning point.
This legislation will be based on language, customs, traditions, so those children that are lost in that system can come back home. And it's all about that jurisdiction and working towards fixing a system that needs to be fixed.
The new legislation is an obligation that Canada has as a nation, says President of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, Nathan Obed.
From the time that there has been Canada and the assertion of control over Inuit, there has been a disrespect for Inuit children's rights. This is ending. This is now going to be replaced with specific legislation that ensures that Inuit children and their rights are upheld.
President of the Métis National Council, Clement Charte, says the legislation means the most to the Métis. He says for over 100 years they've been ignored, marginalized, and their rights denied.
This legislation is another step forward for us. When we get this, we will have a solid basis from which to work, because how can we have a piece of legislation for all Indigenous people, for all our children, and not deal with what has happened to us in the past and work to correct that, to look at the reparations necessary between Canada and the Métis Nation. This legislation is going to take us a long way.
According to Minister Philpott, the goal is to introduce the legislation in the House of Commons by late January. There was no talk of money today, and Philpott says there have been a variety of responses from the provinces, but didn't elaborate on how many are for or against the plan. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Renowned child welfare advocate Cindy Blackstock has been fighting for years for equality for First Nations kids. In 2007, Blackstock filed a human rights complaint against the federal government over the underfunding of First Nations youth. She joined us from our Ottawa studio. Cindy, great to see you. Thanks for joining us. What are your thoughts on the announcement today?
Well, you know, First Nations have been calling for First Nations jurisdiction over child welfare going back at least 18 years when there was a joint First Nations and Government of Canada report calling for just this. But today what we heard was that there's Indigenous legislation, and that's going to be interesting because the needs of First Nations, Métis and Inuit are very distinct, and their relationship with Canada with regard to the delivery of child and family services is very distinct. What they need to avoid is some kind of lowest common denominator legislation, which won't be in the interest of anybody. So we have to see that, and we also need to see Canada break away from its pattern of refusing to fund agencies that operate under First Nations jurisdiction. Currently, they'll only fund an agency if it takes on provincial laws, and that needs to change.
Cindy, you've been pushing for changes in the child welfare system for the past 11 years or longer. How confident are you that this legislation can be put in place before the next election?
Well, if they bring the right people around the table and make the drafting process a co-drafting process with the Department of Justice, then there's some possibility of getting a good piece out there for kids. What I'm worried about is that the Department of Justice on itself, or Indigenous Services Canada, does not have the expertise to be able to draft legislation on its own for our children. And so I would like to see an open process where that is done in a co-development kind of way, where you have folks who are delivering child welfare, elders, traditional knowledge keepers, and youth in care themselves, or youth who are formerly in care, to help inform the best body of work that we can produce.
Cindy, if there was something you were hoping for in this, what would it be?
I'd like to see broad-based equality through the Spirit Bear Plan. One of the things I heard the minister say today that I agree with is that no child should be removed for poverty or because they live in an inadequate home. But if that is actually going to be real on the ground, we need to end all of the inequalities in federal services for all First Nations kids, and that's what the Spirit Bear Plan is. Cost out all the inequalities in water, housing, early childhood, special needs services, education. Let's see what the big ticket is when you add up all those shortfalls and then develop a plan to end it. If we don't do that, then even the very best designed child welfare system is not going to be as effective for families as it needs to be. We need to end those inequalities, and we also need to empower communities to deliver services in culturally appropriate ways that also advance Indigenous languages. That's what I'm hoping to see.
Cindy, always appreciate your insight. Good to see you, and thanks for talking with us here today.
Thanks for having me, Dennis. Have a great day.
There was swift reaction to the announcement by the federal government to give Indigenous peoples control of their children. In Saskatchewan, the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations say they're ready. The FSIN already runs 16 First Nation, Child and Family Services agencies and say they have the ability to take control and jurisdiction over Indigenous children in the province right now. And they plan to move forward right away with the government's new legislation.
First Nation control over our own First Nation children, where we understand the importance of language and culture, where we will treat them with love, respect, and dignity, what they got coming to them, to succeed in life, to give them the best opportunities to succeed in life.
Lack of funding for Indigenous women's shelters. That's a concern that was highlighted at the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Calgary this week. As Tamara Pimentel tells us, one healing lodge in the city invited the commissioners to view their place and see their challenges for themselves.
As the closing oral submissions of parties with standing wrap up in Calgary, the commissioners of the inquiry made one last stop at the Awutan Healing Lodge Society.
The commissioners travel across the country and hear story after story about the supports and services that are required for women and children. We just had an admission of mom with 3 to 4 children, and she was escorted by police and emergency health services, and so that obviously tells us that there is high risk.
Executive Director Josie Niepanak invited the commissioners to see the facility after AWUTAN shared its recommendations at the hearings. For 25 years, the Healing Lodge has been providing Indigenous services for Indigenous women, but it hasn't been easy. With 32 beds, it also provides shelter, and AWUTAN has to turn away at least 100 families a month. As for cultural programming, Niepanak says it isn't viewed as an essential service. The workers and volunteers have to fundraise to provide that.
There's no funding. There's no funding for elder services. There's no funding for the things that a woman would want in a situation like that would make her feel comfortable and that would make her feel dignified.
Like most Indigenous shelters, funding for AWUTAN comes in from the province once a year. That means every year the lodge has to renew its contract.
Multi-year funding would be nice, 5 years. Because I think then we would be in a better position to strategize and to develop our programs further as well.
At the inquiry this week, the lack of funding for Indigenous women shelters from the federal, provincial, and territorial governments was a common theme. The inquiry heard from Inuit Tapuri Kanatami, the national representation of Inuit in Canada, who mostly live in fly-in communities. The cost of flights in the thousands, making it impossible for Inuit to travel to the few shelters that are available to them.
Out of 53 communities throughout Inuit and Nungat, there are only 15 communities that have a shelter. Inuit women and their families are unable to access safe houses and transition houses, and women are leaving their communities to access services in the south.
Anne Manger Rader from the Liard Aboriginal Women's Society in the Yukon says her community has the highest rate of violence in Indigenous women in the country.
The shelters are desperate for funding as women are desperate for a safe place.
The closing oral submissions ended at the tour of AWUTAN. For the society, they just want to be given equal funding.
All we want to do is be operating at the same level as the non-Indigenous women's shelters and our funding issue to be resolved. All we want is for these places to not have to fundraise for the basics. That's the most insulting, racist thing I've ever heard of in the context of an Indigenous women's shelter.
The inquiry will hear more final submissions from parties with standing in Ottawa on December 10 to 14. Tamara Pimentel, APTN National News, Calgary.
Time for a quick break, but stick around. There's more to come. Saturday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. Sunny and +2 for Fredericton. Snow and +3 for Halifax. -7 under sunny skies in Nain. Snow and 0 for Cartwright. +3 and sun for Montreal. -2 and snow for Chibougamau and Saguenay. +4 in Sarnia with showers. 5 above in Windsor with rain. -1 under sunny skies in Thunder Bay. Sunny and -5 for Sioux Lookout. In northern Manitoba, -9 in Churchill. -6 for the Paw. -4 in Winnipeg. -5 in Brandon. In Saskatchewan, -3 for Estevan, Regina, and Saskatoon. -4 in Swift Current. -8 in Uranium City. -4 in Buffalo Narrows. Welcome back. The 60 Scoop class action settlement is moving ahead with implementation. The Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, Carolyn Bennett, joined us to talk about give us an update on the compensation for 60 Scoop survivors. Minister Bennett, thank you for taking some time for us. Can you tell us what is happening on December 1st with regards to the 60 Scoop?
Well, December the 1st is the day that begins the process for all of the survivors of the 60 Scoop to be able to apply for this fund that was created for their benefit in terms of dealing with this terrible chapter in the history of Canada when children were taken from their families, adopted out of their culture, and they have paid a terrible price for this. So there is a fund that's been created between $500 million and $750 million that people will be able to apply to. The administrator of the fund will go out and explain the process, but it's been, I think, very importantly done. It's a very simple one-page application that means you just have to show where you came from and that you've been adopted, and then the administrator of the fund will do all the research, and people will be able to receive the benefit from that fund. We also set up a $50 million foundation that will now have a development board that will lead to a permanent board. But that foundation will also be able to deal with the things that Chief Marcia Brown and the claimants felt were so important and that can't be awarded by a court. Mm-hmm. That is language and culture, healing, all of the things that really are so necessary now in order for us to be properly able to begin to right the wrongs and to be able to help people who were literally survivors or victims of the 60s scoop to get onto a good path.
Minister, if we could switch gears a little, given what took place this past week at the Métis National Council's Assembly, raising concerns about groups falsely claiming to be Métis, and we're just wondering what your position is on negotiating with Métis who are not recognized by the Métis National Council.
So this settlement that begins, will begin tomorrow, is for First Nations and Inuit. There is a separate process going on for Métis, and the Métis National Council is beginning that work. They had a special conference about this, and that work is only now beginning.
Yeah, I was referring to outside of the 60 scoop, just in terms of your own negotiations with Métis organizations that aren't recognized by the Métis National Council.
Yes, well, I think that obviously there has been real problems, I think, with again, some groups, and I think on Riel Day, Daryl LaRue gave a very powerful presentation on the existence of Métis organizations who do not meet the Pauli test, are not Section 35 Métis, and that this needs to be dealt with in a very intentional way by the Government of Canada. The Métis National Council obviously has the governing members from obviously BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. There's also the Métis settlements. There's also people, Métis in Section 35 Métis that live in the Northwest Territories, and that is, so again, that this is very important as we go forward to make sure there's an integrity in the people that are Section 35 rights holders, as opposed to people who maybe think that the definition of Métis applies to them because they have a great-great-great-grandparent that may have been Indigenous, and in some of these organizations, the fact that the great-great-grandparent was French.
Right.
And so the idea of a Michif nation is something that I know that some of the lawyers like Jean Taillé and others are looking at in terms of how we make sure there is an integrity to who are Section 35 rights holders as Métis.
Minister Bennett, we'll have to hold it there, but thanks so much for taking some time for us here today.
Thank you. Okay.
We've got to step aside for another quick break, but stick around. There's more to come. Here's the rest of Saturday's weather forecast. -8 in High Level, -7 for Peace River, -3 and snow for Edmonton, Medicine Hat, and Lethbridge. 8 above and sunny skies for Vancouver and Tofino. -8 in Dease Lake, +5 under the sun in Prince Rupert. In the Yukon, -15 in Old Crow, 16 below in Beaver Creek. Over to NWT, -13 and snow in Yellowknife, -15 for Norman Wells. 22 below in Sax Harbor, -9 in Fort McPherson. In Nunavut, -14 for Chesterfield, -27 in Cambridge Bay. -14 in Clyde River, -29 in Resolute. Welcome back. Few people know about the Tyendinaga standoff in 2008. What started as a dispute over Mohawk land turned into a long fight for answers. As Trina Roach explored in part 1 of Law on the Land, the clash led to multiple arrests. Trina joined us earlier to talk about it. Trina, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Can you tell us what this land dispute was about?
It dates back to 1837. The Mohawk had a tract of land called the Culbertson Tract, that's what's referred to now, that was taken unlawfully from them in 1837. It was accepted by the federal government for negotiation in 2003. But after that, you know, the Mohawk people did not want development to take place on this 900-acre land claim area, and so they had shut down a quarry that was in the site. And then in 2008, a property developer wanted to build a housing unit, and he was going to go in and clear the lot. And that's the context where the Mohawk people had set up blockades and protests, and we saw the police response.
Why is it important, Trina, for the community to get some answers?
You know, I think in 2018, the fact that they have had such trouble getting information from the Ontario government, from the OPP, you know, through freedom of information, and the fact that they still, like, they feel that there was an injustice, that the police response was disproportionate, the use of zip ties was inappropriate, and possibly a human rights abuse, and the fact that there has been no answers or accountability. I think at this point, in part it's persistence, and in part they don't want this to happen again. They don't want there to be a repeat.
Trina, we don't often see a two-part investigates. Why did you decide it warranted that length?
I think, you know, there was so much context to understand this event that happened in 2008, so we needed to allow time for that. There were great characters and voices, but also, you know, we ended up with all this video from the OPP, and so it was a chance, you know, to really show this event that had happened really outside of the public view, using the OPP's own sort of video recordings of it, and then talking to Mohawk people today. And so I think when you have those characters and you have that context, it was really lovely to be able to take the time in a storytelling format to really feel like you could explore the angles in a deeper way.
The visuals are really something. Looking forward to part 2 tonight, Trina. Thanks so much for taking some time for us.
Thanks, Dennis.
That's all the time we have. Thanks for joining us. Good night.